have your attention, please, so we can start this last session. As soon as we start and sooner we finish. Okay?
Thanks, Orly. That's it. We can finish now if you want. I mean, it's...
No. You know, we've kept the best for the end. Okay.
Oh, yeah.
It's really a great pleasure and great honor for me to actually introduce Andrew Linklater, and I'm going to keep it brief. But I want to remind a few points about Andrew's career, which he started at Monash University and then the University of Tasmania and then Keele University and then joined the Department of International Politics at Aberystwyth University as Woodrow Wilson Professor. I guess many of you, as non-IR people, would not know that that department was the first of its kind in the world. Aberystwyth is where international relations was institutionalized as a discipline, and therefore it was very much natural that one of the most distinguished and well-known IR thinker joined that department at some point. Andrew has always been a bridge builder, if I may say, and like Elias, cannot be and probably doesn't want to be labeled and put in a box. Earlier in his career, he built bridges between critical theory and the English school. 20 years ago, he published one of his seminal books, The Transformation of Political Community, Ethical Foundations of the Post-Westphalian Era, considered as the most important book in international relations in that decade. Succeeded Walt's International Politics and preceded Wendt's Social Theory of International Theory, except without the many flaws of the two books. And in the last 10-15 years, Andrew has worked tirelessly to import process sociology and Eliasian thought into IR theories, a much-needed task for IR theory itself, and poor lonely buggers like me, we were trying to do the same, but in far less brilliant and convincing manners. After having devolved much attention to the question of harm, compassion, violence, and the notion of civilization, Andrew has started a new research project focusing on symbol, whose results he will now present in this session. Thank you.
Thank you.
The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. That's very kind of you, Orly. Can I just check first of all that you can hear me at the back? Thank you, and you're not being deafened at the front. I mean, thank you very much. I actually would like to begin by thanking Florence and the organisers for inviting me to give this talk. It's a huge honour to give a talk. It was yet another highly successful, absolutely wonderful conference. So thank you to Florence and the organisers. And I want actually to begin with the words, some of Elias's words that are cited in the conference brochure. We may or may not welcome the increasing integration of humankind, said Elias. And the conference organisers go on to say, 30 years later, it seems that nothing has happened to contradict the assessment of the increasing integration of humankind as a major trend. Or more exactly, they say that integration tensions are part and parcel of the contemporary world. So it's all there in the introduction, and my comments on symbols connect, I think, with those themes, and I will try and bring out the linkages as we go. My starting point is a very simple one, and that is that we seem to live in an age of heightened sensitivity to political symbols, especially symbols that are associated with imperialism and with race. I'll give just one illustration of the point. About 2 years ago, there was a campaign in Oxford, the Rhodes Must Fall campaign, which was an attempt to have the statue commemorating Cecil Rhodes, the famous or infamous imperialist, to have the statue removed from near the outside of Oriel College, Oxford. The statue is still there. I meant to check when I was in Oxford about a month ago and forgot. I think the statue is still there. Whether it should be there or not, I leave to one side. Those of us who are processually inclined might want to suggest that the very existence of the campaign is a manifestation of shifting power balances between traditional establishments and traditional outsiders. We might want to emphasize the fact that, and here I use Goffman's terminology, what was a prestige symbol for some groups, established groups, is a stigma symbol, and perhaps always was, for outsider groups. So it's shifting balances of power between established and outsiders, interlaced, I think, with very interesting generational changes. That, of course, is not the only illustration that any of us could find of how established outsider relations are influencing the configuration of the symbolic world. It's important, I think, to just note in passing the importance of flag symbolism in the recent period. I mean, I have, as you'll guess, I have in mind the statements that Donald Trump made about American football players who were refusing to honor the flags, the controversies around that. And I recall some criticisms of the producers of the film First Man. They were accused, I think, of being insufficiently patriotic. They were not showing Armstrong, firmly, emphatically planting the American flag on lunar soil. So flag symbolism, I think, similarly says something about the politics of established and outsiders. It reflects the views of many that a global establishment has largely ignored, the interests and the value preferences of outsider groups, those left behind, as the lingo is, in the process of globalization. And it's impossible for any Brit talking about symbols to talk for more than 10 minutes without mentioning Brexit and the awfulness of Brexit. And it is the fact remains, whether we like it or not, that for some, not all Brexiteers, institutions like the European Court of Justice are a symbol of something akin to colonial domination. And some Brexiteers do speak an anti-colonial language. They talk about Independence Day. The struggle for national self-determination has on the verge of being realized after several decades of governance by alien strata. Well, enough said perhaps to just highlight the relationship between power struggles between established and outsider groups over the configuration of political communities, and using symbols very much in that context. Maybe enough has been said to just underline the importance of both Elias and Bourdieu and how there are struggles for over the means of orientation in society, and struggles over the symbolic realm and the attempt to control the means of orientation. And then using one of Elias's technical terms, perhaps enough has been said to indicate how these struggles over the symbolic domain influence power chances. They are designed to shift power balances, to increase the power chances of some, to decrease the power chances of others. All of this is background to some comments I now want to make about internationalist or cosmopolitan symbols. It's important that I stress this is work in progress. hopefully will one day be a book on this topic. But this is work in progress. I've kind of skipped, you'll have noticed, the definitional issue. I don't want to spend too much time on the definitional, but perhaps enough just to remind you of Durkheim's saying, a flag is but a bit of cloth, but a soldier will die to save it. In short, what is a process of symbolization? It is the process in which something of no intrinsic meaning, some particular thing of no intrinsic meaning, is converted into a more abstract phenomenon that has enormous emotional significance for large numbers of people. So that's the context, and I've got three main sections for the rest of the presentation, and then some concluding comments. The first section is an attempt to say something about symbols in long-term perspective. This has to be very, very much the short overview. Then something about symbols and international societies, as we call them in international relations, rightly or wrongly. And then finally some comments on the modern state and some features of symbolic struggles in the modern state. And then I'll work my way towards some conclusions really about questions that arise for those of us interested in the symbolic domain. Bourdieu was almost certainly right when he said that all state-organized bureaucratic societies have invested heavily in the symbolic sphere. They've all had what's been called in a specific context in a work on Tsarist Russia. They've all had symbol specialists who've endeavored to construct a whole world of symbolic significance, and they've known, the people who run these states, they've known that symbolic controls are hugely important in the political domain. Elias illustrated the point, as everyone here will know, in court society, where he stressed the fact that at Versailles there was this whole apparatus of symbolic refinement, which outweighed, he said, any financial considerations. I quote directly from court society. He mentioned that prestige fetishism prevailed over any financial consideration. He goes on to say that controls over etiquette and controls over the ceremonial were absolutely crucial for the maintenance of royal power and absolutely central to claims about French glory. He also made, I think, a very interesting point, and I want to just develop this a little, and this will take me to integration-disintegration processes. He made the point that without that symbolic realm, Louis XIV might have been more vulnerable to assault by a particular person or specific faction. It's an interesting point, I think, about how the symbolic domain may, to some extent, have tipped the balance or shaped the balance between Louis and those who were distrustful or opposed to him. And I think from memory, he develops this point in a very, very interesting way. I can't recall if the same point is made by Bourdieu, others in the room will know. But the same point is made by some students of archaic states, and Runciman comes to mind in this context. And the point I want to make runs something like this. States have sought to gain control over the instruments of violence, they've sought to gain control over the rights of taxation, and they've sought to gain control over the means of orientation through the symbolic sphere. Those monopolizations are interdependent. Strengths in one domain, along one axis, could well be transferred into gains in other axes, but there's a converse flow. To lose symbolic power, to witness a decline in symbolic power, then might risk controls over the instruments of violence and over the right of tax. It's an interesting thesis that's being put out there, and it's something I want to explore in future work. Certainly a very interesting study of Tsarist and Soviet symbolism by one of Robert's colleagues in Sydney makes the point that regimes that lack convincing, compelling grand narratives with all the symbolic underpinnings are prone to crumble. This is an important part of the maintenance of power. So integration, disintegration tensions are in my mind here. The groups attempt to centralize power. Other groups try to resist them. They try to preserve their autonomy or to set up some independent power base. And symbol innovations are important here in shaping the balance of power between those who wish to centralize and those who wish to decentralize. I mean, I should make that less like a thesis and more like a conjecture. I mean it to be something to be explored in other work. So I'm just raising the question of the importance of symbol innovation in shifting power balances between those who wish to centralize, to integrate, and those who wish to pull things apart or push a process of disintegration. We know that many of these state-organized societies have failed. History is littered with examples of so-called vanished kingdoms. It's very interesting to examine those processes, how disintegration sets in and leads to the demolition of state-organized groups. But, and here I turn to an important theme in Elias's writings, if we look at human history over the long term, we see a marked tendency towards the development of societies of what he called greater magnitude, larger scale social and political units, to which I want to add, this is in Elias, but not in the passage I've got in mind, but also destructive power. One of the major long-term patterns in human history has been that very, very long-term process. And the importance of the symbolic domains I've been suggesting is crucial here. And it's important in this context, I think, to just pause to make some observations about symbol theory and what Elias has to say about symbol, about the role of symbols in shifting power balances in symbol theory. And it seems to me that there are 3 points he makes here that I want to just note, and then I'm going to develop one of them in a bit more detail. He maintains that symbols played an important role in shifting the balance of power between genetic restraints on behavior and cultural restraints. As genetic restraints on behavior were weakened, as human groups developed, so cultural restraints became more important, and symbols were absolutely crucial. Symbols of the supernatural or symbols of a sacred dimension were absolutely crucial in this process. Secondly, he stresses the ways in which symbol innovation changed the balance of power between human societies and non-human societies. Human societies became more centralized, larger in scale. It tilted the balance of power between traditional predators and human groups. And symbol innovation also was part and parcel of shifts and balances of power between human societies, and crucial to the development of societies of greater magnitude and increased destructive power. And I want to just highlight 2 themes in this context. One is the importance of warrior symbolism in early human groups and in later human groups. We are talking about male warrior symbolism in the most part, but I have in mind here the notion that the weapon has a sacred dimension to it, that warriors raise their social status by accumulating body parts. Later, the flags and the standards of their enemy. There are power balances shifting within societies and between societies in this context. But to give an account of how societies became larger in scale, it seems important to focus much of one's attention on male warrior symbolism, and how people were persuaded not to flee, to be the first to flee, as Hobbes famously observed, but to fight and to kill and to die for their social group. There is a link to be made between warrior symbolism and sacred kingship. My thinking here is very much focused on how, over roughly 5 millennia, ruling groups insisted that they were the intermediaries between ordinary humans and the gods or spiritual forces. They insisted that they were the bastions against chaos and disorder, to the extent there could be bastions against chaos and disorder. And one sees in the symbolism of sacred kingship elements of the old warrior symbolism is carried over into more complex symbolic codes. One example, given time, may do representations of Egyptian pharaohs trampling their enemies. They are simultaneously, they have a special relationship with the gods, and they have a special relationship in subduing adversaries and protecting the society from all sorts of threats. So here we have established groups constructing symbolic universes which are designed to impose relations of dependence on others. Others must depend on the sacred king, the warrior king, for some form of social equilibrium, for some natural equilibrium, conceivably. And all of this is feeding in, I think, to an account of how one gets to societies of greater magnitude and increased destructive power. So integration, disintegration tendencies then, vanished kingdoms, but the long-term trend that Elias mentioned is crucial. Is what is highlighted in the first page of the conference brochure. I'm turning now to symbols in world politics because there is a higher level of integration. I call them international societies or international networks. Larger figurations, if you like, that link together court societies, if not societies as a whole. I want to acknowledge a debt here to Abraham de Swan, who in one of his papers in Theory, Culture and Society emphasizes how important kinship symbolism has been in the redefinition and the reconstruction of political communities. And certainly when one looks at, for example, relations between monarchs in the so-called ancient Near East, they frequently use kinship symbolism to commit themselves to at least some restraints on the use of force, and to commit themselves to observing some diplomatic rituals. So they would talk about brotherhood. They would talk about the brotherhood of kings. There's some very, very interesting work on that. And that language of kinship symbolism survived until well into the 19th century. At the end of the Revolutionary Wars, the Holy Alliance maintained that the members were bound together by an unbreakable fraternity. The rulers governed, they said, like fathers of families, in the same spirit of brotherhood. We don't hear quite so much of that these days, but the family of nations is an interesting, attempt to convey that sense of fraternity in in a world of nations. Well, certain kind of, we can call this integration processes. They're not monopolization processes, I suppose, but there are integration processes here. They're invariably, of course, weaker than the processes that have led to states, the states that are part of these networks. I mean, for the most part, they are weaker. For the most part, the symbols that have been used to convey brotherhood have had nothing like the same strength as the symbols that bind people together in their particular political communities. Thucydides has appeared twice today. He's made a kind of miraculous reappearance in the very recent period. I'm going to draw him into this discussion because he showed rather beautifully, I think, how the symbolism that was crucial to a Hellenic civilizing process collapsed during the struggles between Athens and Sparta. And Thucydides devoted quite a bit of time to how the symbols of the games, some symbols regarding the sacred nature of the temple, were undercut during the wars, and as a consequence of all this, the Hellenes, who prided themselves on their greater civilization, who despised barbarians, who mutilated the bodies of the enemy dead, became as barbaric as their some of the traditional enemies. The question that is, in a sense, is posed by Thucydides indirectly. His work is a possession forever, remember. The question is, why should the modern state system be any different? I mean, on what basis might we conclude that the sovereign state system has a chance of avoiding a similar fate of basically collapsing into internecine warfare? And one might ask in this context, what part might global symbols play in shaping some of the tensions here, how they're played out in struggles between nation states. And here I think it's perhaps worthwhile just making a very rough, very, very crude distinction between two types of symbol. I'll call one interstate, and I'll call the other cosmopolitan. The first existed in ancient Greece, the second perhaps not. But classicists are better positioned than I am to make judgments, to make calls on that one. But as an example of an interstate symbol, I'll call attention to Munich. Munich is a symbol of the dangers of appeasing rising powers, and Munich, in some ways, is a symbol of the imperative of integrating at a level beyond the nation state, simply through a balance of power system. But Munich also comes with the caveat that if the alliance falls apart, if you do not trust others in the alliance, then go it alone. And if you go it alone, the chances are the rest of them will go it alone, and you have not integration through balance of power systems, but unilateralism emulated conceivably by all, and it all gets very, very messy, and the world becomes a much more unpredictable and conflictual place. So there are these interstate symbols. There are cosmopolitan symbols as well. Elias, beautifully in the Germans, I think, stresses what he called the duality of nation-state normative codes. On the one hand, there is the emphasis on the nation-state as the ultimate collectivity. On the other hand, there are conceptions of human equality and concerns about behaving in a human or in a civilized way in relations between societies under conditions of conflict. It's a fascinating notion, and it leads to issues about how this affects the symbolic world. Monuments to the war dead. We are very familiar with monuments to the war dead, and we are familiar too with cosmopolitan symbols, about which more in a moment, and we are aware of how societies, some at certain points, actually find it quite hard to negotiate their way here between what look like competing symbols. My illustration is how Brits over the years have debated how and whether to commemorate bomber commands, and whether and how to symbolize the belief that bomber command made a huge difference in the outcome of the Second World War. And every so often a debate turns up in the UK about the importance of recognizing the contribution of all these young men who've been ignored down the years. And on the other hand, people say, well, but let's not forget the enormous human cost of these bombing campaigns. Elias refers to the entanglements of civilized peoples, the torments and the tortures they get themselves into. Maybe this is not torture, but it's an indication of the kinds of problems that societies can face as they endeavour to establish the sorts of symbols that are appropriate, given the desire to commemorate the war dead, but at the same time reflect on some wider cosmopolitan or internationalist, if you prefer, dimensions. Well, all I will say is that we need to keep an eye on what I'll simply call colour symbolism to highlight the importance of some cosmopolitan themes. It's interesting how colour symbolism is so important in the emphasis on internationalist or cosmopolitan ideals: the red cross, the red crescent, the white flag, the blue helmet, I suppose greenness in connection with environmental moments, and I'm sure you can think of others. So nation states they're caught up in wider networks. There are these integrative tendencies at a higher level of the nation state. Cosmopolitan symbols, colour symbolism is part of that. At the same time, there are these disintegrative tendencies because of the importance of national symbolism for human groups. Will the balance of power shift between these different types of symbols? What will that mean for the balance of power between integrative and disintegrative tendencies? I'm tempted to say, well, don't ask me. Who knows how these different dynamics will play out? But this takes me to some my third section, some comments on the modern state, and I think maybe it's important here just to remind you of how nation states have fought for control over the symbolic domain, how they've endeavoured to maintain their controls over the means of orientation. Two examples. One could think of many others. I'm sure you can think of many others. But I read an interesting book on how the European Union Commission some years ago tried to introduce a European textbook. And many nation states said, national governments said, no to that. We have national histories. We don't want to get entangled in all this European stuff, And so that's interesting. I think how states have choices. They could go one way or the other. It's clear where most of them have gone. There's been some interesting work on the significance of the Apollo missions on the first images of planet Earth. Was it Apollo 8? I've forgotten now which ones they were. It's perhaps not important. But some groups, I think Friends of the Earth, portrayed those images as sort of symbols of this rather fragile-looking planet, suspended God knows where. And it's the homeland for all humanity. And American administrations were quick to point out, well, actually, what this tells us is that the Americans have defeated the Soviet Union in the struggle for technological supremacy. This is the being on the moon is a symbol of technological military prowess and a reason for collective pride in the United States in the context of these famous superpower rivalries. Well, about 4 or 5 years ago, quite an interesting book by a man called Bartelson on the symbolism of sovereignty appeared, in which he said, I thought it was an extremely interesting point, that states are losing some of their symbolic power, some of the power they've had as a consequence of controls over monuments and currency and flags are kind of disappearing. And this was part of a more general mood in my own field of international relations to highlight the ways in which states were losing some of their capacity to define principles of legitimacy in world politics. That, NGOs were increasingly involved in defining the criteria to be used to establish whether national governments were behaving ethically or not. And it's just worth pointing out, and this is part confession, that I think a large number of us thought that there was an interesting shift in the course of the through the 90s into the early part of the 2000s, a kind of shift towards a more sort of post-national set of orientations. Well, we were in for a surprise. The surprise being the resurgence of national-populist movements. I was harking back a moment ago to the symbolism of Brexit and the ECJ and all of that. It's been really quite shocking to many of us, surprising at any rate, that these national symbols prove to be so strong. Images of notions of parliamentary sovereignty in the UK. That sovereignty is a symbol of independence. Theresa May, my beloved leader, refers to the passport as a symbol of a proud and great nation. And they're all into it, using this kind of language. And some of us were surprised. I don't think students of nationalism would have been hugely surprised, because down the years they've been saying, well, you sort of look a little bit deeper and you'll find that national sentiments remain strong. There's a very interesting literature on, for example, world memory. A number of people writing on nationalism. Anthony Smith is one. The stress. What is there in the way of a world memory compared with a national memory? What is there? What is there that's out there? And someone else involved in this debate said, well, maybe there's some notion that that there was a Holocaust and most people know about it, and it's part of some kind of world understanding. But the author goes on to say these things are lowest common denominators. When you get down to it, those so-called world memories do not go deep. They do not go very, very far. Partly because Orderly is waving green things at me, green symbolism. I will pass on whether environmental movements need world memories. But I think they need symbols, and they have some symbols, I suppose. Books like Jared Diamond's Guns, Germs, whatever it's called, is a kind of symbol for many of the need for a long-term perspective to think in rather different ways about the relationship between human groups and so-called nature. Complications set in here when we start thinking about global symbols. Of course, those who are attached to national groups will stress, well, we're not terribly interested in these cosmopolitan symbols, thank you very much. They don't speak to us. They represent some kind of elite. And this idea comes through in all sorts of interesting places. There's a very interesting book on global injustice symbols that stresses Mandela and Gandhi are global symbols, symbols of concerns for humanity. But for the most part, these symbols have been hijacked by Western groups. They're not really cosmopolitan symbols at all. They've been hijacked by particular groups. I think this just raises an interesting question about the kind of test that those who wish to manufacture symbols that are cosmopolitan have to undergo. And here I go back to the points with which I began. You have groups of a postmodern or post-colonial disposition who are very skeptical of anything that has the name cosmopolitan or global attached to it. And there's a pincer effect here because you've got other groups who are arguing that national loyalties and national symbolism takes precedence over anything allegedly cosmopolitan. Some concluding thoughts. We know that symbols come and go. We know that they rise and fall. We don't know a hell of a lot about the actual processes in which people developed universal symbols, global symbols. I have a normative commitment to them, let me make that clear. We don't know very much about this. But looking at so-called world religions is interesting. There's a very fine book on Christianity and Roman society which begins with the question, how on earth did this small splinter group, this stigmatized group in the Roman Empire end up basically transforming the entire social and political system? How did this little group emerge with a whole symbolism centered on prophets and saints, on crosses and so forth? How did it actually emerge and have the transformative effect that took place? That's a very, very interesting way into the study of Christianity and the Roman Empire, and it just makes me wonder: is there some marginal group out there, some interstitial group, in Michael Mann's language, that we're not presently aware of? That could be the future movement that promotes cosmopolitan symbols. We don't know. I mean, how do we look for them? What would count as evidence of important shifts? There's enormous work to be done in this domain. I want to end. Have I got 2 or 3 minutes? I just want to end with some sort of final thoughts about symbolism, and then coming back to the conference statement I mentioned earlier. Here is Durkheim. Social life in all its aspects and in every period of history has been made possible only by a vast symbolism. Social sentiments have a precarious existence, I paraphrase, unless embedded in shared symbols. If you're an international relations student, you might say, well, global order could perhaps rest on shared interests and common principles, but in actual fact, how deep do they go? How far can a global order, how far can it command the emotional allegiance of people without common symbols of common identification to cite Elias in a different context? And if societies cannot construct global symbols, then what happens? Are we just left with double-bind processes that societies cannot control, disintegrative tendencies in the sense that national attachments and national symbolism continue to dominate? How might global symbols develop? Where might they come from? How might they pass the kinds of tests that I mentioned a moment ago? How might we get to the stage where, because of common symbols, people, and I go back to the conference statement, welcome the increasing integration of humankind? They don't fear it or wish to react against it, but they welcome it. Where might the relevant symbols come from? Well, those, I think, are some questions that arise for those of us interested in symbols and world politics. Thank you very much.
This was probably implicit in in your thinking, but I'm just wondering if it might be useful to bring it more to the surface. And what I'm thinking of is the performativity, the performativity of symbols. So if you think, and the practices that are associated with them to kind of bring them to life and mobilize them. So if you think about the royal family, for example, as a set of symbols, it depends heavily on a set of practices, things like the royal weddings.
Yes, absolutely.
Right? So I'm trying to draw attention more to the activities that
yes, no, good. I think that, yes, that's a hugely important point. I think this takes us back to Durkheim and the importance of ritual and all that. Does it not? Yes, you're right. And I was struck by the fact that as part of the celebrations, that's the right word, of the end of the First World War, Macron and Merkel shared the same stage. I mean, it's possible one can nationalize suffering and say it's only our people really who matter, and then you've got the rituals and the ceremonies and all that go with that. Or you can move towards a position where you argue that all sorts of people through unplanned processes were massacred, and this is a European crisis, or was a European crisis, and there should be some kind of ritual, some performativity, as you put it, Robert, that commemorates that. Yeah, absolutely, I agree with you. So in a sense, you're rephrasing one of my questions. You're really saying, well, where may the performances come from? Where may the rituals and the ceremonies come from? Well, without taking too much time, because other people will want, hopefully, to ask questions. I mean, we've got some ceremonies. They're not very strong. Excuse me. The Olympic Games opening ceremonies and all that, but by God, they are very, very limited compared with national performativity remains dominant. Is what I'm saying.
Good.
I mean, one of the things you mentioned in passing, of course, is that some symbols are objects.
Yes.
And I wondered whether or not it might be useful to think of the duality of some such symbols, which point in, first of all, in an expressive dimension, which is, I think, what you've emphasised in your discussion, in uniting individuals as a community of some kind, and also in a kind of instrumental or cognitive direction, in that objects are part of the process by which we also grasp the world. So I would think of examples in museums, particularly in national museums, where you go to a national museum and here you find the great contributions of German engineering and science, as well as finding out about engineering and science. And it's that duality, I think. So, for example, just to give one example, when in the early 1900s the Piltdown hoax was perpetrated, it was advertised as the missing link. So here we have this wonderful kind of revelation about the missing link, but it's found in England. So we have the first Englishman. And now that is naive to us now, but that duality, I think, is quite important in understanding how symbols may work. I mean, they don't all work in that way, but many of them do, I think. Yes,
that's very, very helpful, and I just want to absorb it rather than, if you don't mind, respond. I think there's some deep thoughts, very deep thoughts in there, Gordon. But having read your work on museums and a few pieces on museums, you kind of get the sense of how museums are national, began as national museums and sort of celebrations of empire in many ways. But yet, they've been invited to transform themselves and to be somewhat less obviously devoted to celebrating the past, empire and so forth. So giving things back is perhaps one of the key examples of this. But no, but as that's a very, on the train back to we're catching the same train. We can talk further about this, I hope.
Bills?
Yeah. Well, thank you very much for your interesting presentation. You talked about two different levels. One level of symbols, like means of orientation, communication, and regulation, and the other level is the power shift.
Yes.
And I don't know how you exactly see this connection. Is it like symbols? My impression was that you put the emphasis on symbols to change the power shift. But I think in a work of Elias, at least they go hand in hand.
Yeah, oh
Even
yes.
if
Yeah.
not, the power shift should take place in order to change the symbols. It's like its relationship. Could you
Yes.
elaborate?
Yes. Well, sorry if I was confusing, but I think I'm with you on this. That I mean, it's not a question of there are symbols there, and then people are playing power games here. The symbols are reflections of past ongoing power struggles. Whether people perceive some symbols as being their symbols or not, being the symbols of that they care for, or symbols that only established groups really care for, is another matter. I suppose what I was trying to get at with, I suppose what I'm thinking of, when I think from, we get kind of sort of autobiographical, a little dangerous here, but I don't recall anybody being bothered about the Cecil Rhodes statue 40 or 50 years ago. It was sort of taken for granted as being the kind of thing you stick outside Oxford College. What else would you do? What would you put there? And then there are power shifts. There's an anti-imperial movement. There are students from various parts of the world who have a post-colonial orientation and feel clearly, very strongly, that they have to pass those symbols every day, and then the symbols become contested. So they kind of enshrine certain power relations, and then they become the means through which certain power struggles are worked through. That's what I'm trying to get at. I'm not trying to separate things. I'm trying to work out how they're interconnected. Does that? Yeah.
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. Quite inspiring talk, I thought, actually. It makes exciting research programme awaits.
Thank you very much.
I'm interested in some of your earlier work. You talk obviously a lot about the ancient city-states and the late medieval, early modern city-states. Now this might be total tosh in your view. The writers like Saskia Sassen, who's attempted to bring Weber back into contemporary sociology to some extent. She very much wants to argue, doesn't she, along with the late Doreen Massey, about the role of the global city.
Yes.
And the sense in which, and in what sense do you see that global cities like London, and obviously the opposition of London symbolically to Brexit in the UK?
Yes.
Yeah. Whether then are these new loci of challenges to both the national and the global, or are they actually part of the global? Really?
It's a hugely important. I'm aware of the issue, having looked at a couple of pieces in a recent journal, Global Society and the Global City, but I haven't really researched this in any detail. Right. So I take the point on board, and I mean you're right about how the idea of the city is mobilised in these discussions. So just to give again, it's a British example. I apologise for that, but again we're talking Brexit inevitably. The MP for Hackney in London, Diane Abbott, frequently asserts that London is a cosmopolitan city. All these people are there. They're getting along reasonably well for the most part. It's something to celebrate. And so it becomes a symbol of what other people regard as being, in some sense, well, whatever they think. I don't know. I won't try and summarize it. But thank you. I take the point, very much take the point on board. And if this project were, if I was 12 months further on, maybe I'd have more to say on that. But I have to leave it there.
Sure.
Forgive me. I have to leave it there.
I wanted to ask you a question. How would you define the relationship between what you call narratives? I would prefer the term discourses. And symbols, and between narratives or discourses and symbols. And the second question is, it's not it's an indirect question. I would ask you, what is your opinion or your idea about what Helmut Kusmic just said in the previous lecture about the breakdown of or the process of parliamentarization and functional democratization in the Austrian Empire as the prelude to the mother of all nationalisms. So you have intertwined a process of democratization and functional democratization with the rise of nationalism.
Yes. Well, on the first point, I think I go back to something that Gordon said, that I mean, symbols take many different forms. Durkheim has a great list of them: material objects, figureheads. I forget now all the things on his list, but one could throw narratives in there. I mean, they can be as important as flags and as figureheads. I'm thinking of historical narratives in particular that have symbolic importance for people. I mean, the discussions and the debates in the UK down the years about whether national history should be in some sense superseded by, and many people on the conservative side of the fence argued that, of course, the histories must be celebratory. They must be about the nation state. So we are, the symbolic importance is absolutely crucial. On the second point, I have to apologise to Helmut, because I had to go out halfway through your talk, and I couldn't get back in through the door that I'd gone out of.
Like Brexit.
I didn't want to come in while you were talking. I was trying to wait until you'd finished, but so I missed a large part of Helmut's talk, which is my way of saying, could you ask Helmut what? Could you ask Helmut what he? Maybe not now. Maybe Helmut doesn't want to answer the question.
Maybe later. A question. Please go.
I thank you very much for your intervention.
Thank you, David.
I found it really nice. Really good. I noticed that you said that objects do not have an intrinsic meaning, and that symbols come to give them a full meaning. So
yeah.
I wonder if one can apply this to the human condition in the way that how can a body that has no intrinsic meaning at all inside of it,
Yes,
develop a form of orientation that is based
a body.
on meaning.
Mm-hmm.
So do you think this question should be a major question?
Yes. Well, let's think of the body of Christ, and a body, other things being equal, of no greater significance than anybody else's body. However, so yes, indeed. If I was smarter on my feet, I could perhaps think of other examples of body symbolism.
The Queen.
The Queen.
I mean, there's lots of monarchs that themselves say.
Yes, thank you. And you have in mind the old great book by Kantorowicz on the king's two bodies, the physical body that ends up in the ground, and the other body which is where there's the link with God.
And from a scientific point of view, I mean, of the body of human, like in the way we understand it in modern societies, how can symbols arise from a body that does not have a meaning in itself? I mean, I don't know if I'm clear.
Well, if I said to you, just the first thing comes into my head. If I said to you, David, what about the warriors' tattoos in let's say in Maori groups, as I understand. I mean, the body becomes a kind of text, and
Okay.
So,
Well,
sorry,
Norman, sorry. We have to be very quick. I think Florence is pushing. No?
It's not just, I know it's early work in the market, which is great. Just the symbolic continuity across generations. What's going through my head is why certain symbols continue down generations, and why certain symbols are modified or become different. And I'm then thinking about, in a political context, where national defeats. I don't know why I'm thinking this particularly very simplistic image, but the Japanese flag before, obviously, before the Second World War and after the Second World War, and then I'm trying to use that as a kind of, for want of a better term, a pretty abstract generalization, but just the way symbols, some of them disappear, some of them come into vogue, and whether that's related to the national images.
Well, I think it's part of the answer to this question, Norman, that we are talking here about power. We are talking about power relations. Had I had slightly longer, I would have mentioned Michael Walzer in a very old paper on political symbols, in which he says we need to understand three things. First of all, how did, quote, the slow erosion of old symbols take place? How does this happen? Secondly, how did meaningful alternatives come into play? And then how did particular groups demonstrate their quote-unquote artistic and intellectual success in constructing symbols? Those are beautifully phrased questions by Walzer. Posed in an article, I think published in I have it here, 1967. 1967, Walzer comes up with this. Those questions could be posed now in much the same way, with some confidence that the answers to the questions when first posed have not moved on very much. Maybe that's unfair on all sorts of people, so I should qualify that. But has there been substantial progress in answering the questions that you are raising? I'm not sure. I must leave it somewhat open like that.
Abraham?
Yeah, this is, since we happen to be in Brussels this week, it so happens that tomorrow the Royal Museum of Africa will reopen after a debate of 10 years. And it was one of the most provocative and most belated symbols of a small European country, Belgium, being a world empire. Now, almost from the first, this empire and imperial ambition was tainted with some shame, especially the English were shaming Belgium. And somehow, this museum lasted in its ostentatious colonial imperial shape until a few years ago and became more and more of an embarrassment. Now, if you buy tomorrow's papers, because the press conference was yesterday and we happened to be invited at the pre-opening, you will see the complete dismantlement of Belgian national and imperial symbols, and where they have remained, they have become a mark of shame. And there is a special room of shame with the old statues that used to be in the central hall, and which are now decoded 180 degrees.
Right.
And the 50 little vignettes of Leopold II, Attila the Hun, are sort of pockmarks in the building, because they, in a way, conserve a good part of the building. But what comes instead of this dismantlement of Belgian tradition? Well, one attempt was to have Brussels be the European capital, which it is. And in many European countries, the national flag is displayed with the European flag, and certainly here in Belgium it always is.
Yeah.
But in the Museum Tervuren, there is no way to find a new kind of symbol of what the hell Belgium has to do with Congo. And the collection of what is now called subaltern arts, this is a new word, it used to be primitive art, been exhibited on a much smaller scale because the diaspora demands restitution. And here the director is in a complete bind. So this museum has denuded itself in many senses. There are many African voices talking on videos, but in a way there is no Belgian voice left. And there is no, the only pride is that there are a global scientific institute with settlements everywhere and scholars coming to Brussels, to Tervuren from all over the world. But if you want to see embarrassment and shame about national symbolism, you're invited to look at tomorrow's papers.
Well, thank you ever so much.
Well, if there was any scorn, the joke is on us, the Dutch, we have exactly the same problem.
Right. No, that's entirely new to me. I will be following that up and discussing that with Gordon Fife on the train tomorrow.
Sorry, I didn't hear you.
I'll follow. Thank you very much for that. I will follow that up, Abraham. I will follow that up.
Is that a wrap? Is that a wrap? Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Florence, maybe you have
To say a few words, most unusually for me, it probably will be just a few words, but let me just go back to the opening of the conference when the four organisers talked, Barbara and I in particular, talked about the risks of appearing sectarian and oh, those funny Eliasians. There are risks, there's no doubt about that, but I think these 2.5 days have shown just how fruitful it can be to come together every so often and spend some time quarrying all the insights and the great virtue of Elias is that he shows he's a synthetic thinker who connects so many things, and that's what I've always found so wonderful. And it'll take us some time to digest all the new ideas we've heard here. But Johnny Connolly was saying to me just a little while ago that, of course, we all ourselves attend other conferences on, historical sociology, political sociology, criminology, sociology of sport, you name it. And those are also valued, of course. In the context of the last couple of sessions, we also tend to attend national sociological associations and some international ones as well. I still think it's not entirely. I don't know whether it's worth recording for posterity, actually. But I don't think that this is a substitute for this jolly, fruitful gathering which takes place every few years. And I'd like to say thank you to the Norbert Elias Foundation. In spite of the institutional affiliation that Florence gave me, I am no longer a member of the board of the Norbert Elias Foundation, but without their support this wouldn't have happened. But especially to the Université Saint-Louis, and of course to Florence herself. It's all very well saying there were 4 organisers, there were also local organisers, but the burden fell on Florence, and the rest of us really played the role of trying to say, don't worry, it'll be all right on the night, because the stress of it all for a conference of this size has been enormous. So particular thanks to Florence.
Thank you. Thank you. Don't worry, I'll be very brief because I'm obviously exhausted, as you all are, I imagine. So I just want to tell you thank you, indeed. There will be definitely no more closing remarks. We had two beautiful, wonderful, I would say, two last wonderful closing sessions. And indeed, I think that we are not presently closing anything in the term of closing, and just an opening. So I just wanted to say to you a brief au revoir, especially to those who are going back to their home tonight, and to those who won't be present at the breakfast tomorrow morning. And again, just a huge thank to all those who participate to this conference, made it possible, and made it, in my point of view, a wonderful conference with, yes, you said it, fascinating talks and debates on an impressive number of different subjects. So I'm particularly happy that such a gathering, that was the first objective of the conference, gathering all the people of the network, and that was a success. And I'm happy that such a gathering has been possible, but also that we proved to be an open community. I don't like the word community, but an open one, open to newcomers, indeed, to new fields, to new generations. Yesterday someone told me, I cannot remember exactly who, wow, there are so many women now. I said, do you think so? Well, there are more than 20 years ago, but there are not so many women, but we are, well, that's a different and enlarging in many ways a community. And so nothing else. Finally, I want to thank again the team here in Saint Louis, not myself indeed, the very small team that well, above all, Anne-Alexandra Fournier, Teresa again, and Hugo, who did a wonderful job in, indeed, you appreciate it, I think, very difficult conditions due to a very small university as ours. But we did it, definitely we did it. And, well, thank you all. Thank you.